I got married really when I was about 16, so I've been married all my life. And before that, I just didn't know.
There's a certain kind of man you remember, not for what he said, but for what he never explained. And if you've ever known someone like that, you already understand how this story ends. Robert Mitchum was one of those men. Quiet, unreadable. The kind who could walk into a room and leave without anyone ever truly knowing him. But if you've lived long enough, you know something most people don't. The real story of a man is never in his fame. It's in the people he couldn't hold on to, and the one who refused to leave. 7 women crossed his life. Some stayed for moments. Some left marks he never spoke about. And one stayed through everything. This isn't a story about romance. It's about truth. The woman who stayed when he never promised to. Before the fame, before the headlines, before the world decided who he was, there was Dorothy Spence. They married in 1940. No cameras, no spectacle. Just 2 young people stepping into a life neither of them could fully predict. And for a man like Robert Mitchum, prediction was never part of the plan. He was never the type to promise forever. Not in words, not even in behavior. Because as the years unfolded, Hollywood came with its temptations. Long nights, distant locations, women who understood the language of charm and silence. And Mitchum never pretended to resist it. But here's what makes this story different. Dorothy knew. She knew the kind of man she had married. Not the actor, not the myth, the man. And instead of trying to change him, she did something far more difficult. She stayed exactly as she was. There were no public confrontations, no dramatic exits, no desperate attempts to compete with a world that was never meant to be hers. She built a home, raised their children, and waited, not in weakness, but in quiet understanding. And somehow, he always came back. That's the part people misunderstand. Mitchum may have drifted, but he never disappeared. Not completely, not permanently, because Dorothy wasn't just his wife. She was the one place in his life that didn't demand anything from him. And sometimes, for a man like Robert Mitchum, that kind of love is the only kind he knows how to keep. The affair that felt too real to be just acting. By 1964, Robert Mitchum had already mastered something most men spend a lifetime trying to hide: how to feel without showing it. Then came the Carpetbaggers, and with it, Carroll Baker. She wasn't like the others. There was a sharpness to her presence, an intensity that didn't need to announce itself. On screen, their chemistry didn't build slowly. It arrived fully formed, as if something had already begun long before the cameras started rolling. People on set noticed, not in loud, scandalous ways, but in the quiet details, the way conversations lingered, the way silence between them didn't feel empty, the kind of closeness that doesn't ask permission. Nothing was ever officially confirmed. That was Mitchum's way. No declarations, no denials, just absence where answers should be. But Hollywood has always understood one thing: real connection is hard to fake. And this didn't look like acting. For a man who kept his emotions carefully guarded, Baker seemed to reach a place most never could. Not dramatically, not publicly, but enough to leave a mark. And yet, like everything else in his life, it didn't last. There were no endings, no scenes of goodbye, just distance, work finished, lives moving forward, and whatever existed between them left behind without explanation. That was Mitchum's pattern. He didn't break hearts loudly. He simply stepped away and let silence do the rest. But something about this one lingered longer than it should have. Not because it changed him, but because, for a brief moment, it almost did. The love that almost broke his rules. By the time Robert Mitchum arrived in Ireland to film Ryan's Daughter in 1970, he had already learned how to keep his life divided. Work was work. Home was home, and whatever happened in between stayed there. That was the rule. Then came Sarah Miles. The setting didn't help. Remote coastline, endless wind, long days that blurred into long nights, the kind of isolation that strips people down to who they really are. And Miles, she wasn't someone you could keep at a distance. She was open, emotional, unfiltered in a way Mitchum had spent his entire life avoiding. At first, it looked like another passing connection, a familiar rhythm, shared scenes, quiet conversations, a growing ease between two people who understood the unspoken language of film sets. But something shifted. This wasn't just chemistry. It was exposure. Miles didn't try to decode him. She didn't chase him. She met him exactly where he stood. And somehow, that made it harder for him to remain untouched. For once, Mitchum wasn't the one in control of the emotional distance. And that's what made it dangerous. Those close to the production would later suggest what everyone quietly understood. This wasn't just professional closeness. It had crossed into something real, something felt. But Mitchum had rules, even if he never spoke them out loud. Nothing was allowed to follow him home. And so, like the others, it ended not with a confrontation, but with a return, back to the life that had always been waiting for him. Still, this one left a different kind of trace. Because for a brief moment in Ireland, Robert Mitchum came closer than he ever should have. The one he could laugh with, but never keep. Not every connection in Robert Mitchum's life was built on intensity. Some felt easy. Jane Russell was one of those rare people who didn't need to break through his silence, because she never tried to. She met him with something much simpler: humor, confidence, and a kind of effortless presence that made everything feel lighter than it really was. When they worked together on His Kind of Woman in 1951, the chemistry was immediate, not dramatic, not consuming, just natural, the kind of connection that doesn't ask questions. Russell had a personality that filled a room without overwhelming it. She could joke, tease, hold her ground, and Mitchum responded in a way few people ever saw. He laughed more, spoke more, stayed a little longer in conversations that, with others, he might have quietly exited. People noticed that, because Mitchum wasn't known for giving much of himself away. And yet, even here, where things felt uncomplicated, there was an invisible line. Whatever existed between them never fully crossed into something real. Or if it did, it never stayed long enough to leave a mark the way others had. Maybe that was the reason. There was no tension to hold on to, no emotional weight to make it linger. Just two people who understood each other in a moment that didn't ask for permanence. And for Mitchum, that may have been exactly the point. Because the truth is, he didn't always walk away from women because things were difficult. Sometimes, he walked away because they weren't. And Jane Russell? She may have been the one person who could have made life easier for him. But easy was never something Robert Mitchum chose to keep. The woman who matched his darkness too perfectly. Some connections don't need to happen to feel real. That's what makes the idea of Ava Gardner and Robert Mitchum so difficult to ignore. They moved through the same world, the same era, the same kind of late nights where conversations were quieter, heavier, and often unfinished. Both carried something beneath the surface, an edge that didn't soften with fame, but sharpened because of it. Gardner wasn't just beautiful. She was complicated, emotional in ways she didn't try to hide. And Mitchum, he was the opposite, controlled, guarded, a man who felt deeply, but revealed almost nothing. On paper, they should have collided. And maybe, in some quiet way, they did. There were no headlines linking them, no confirmed stories, no moment you can point to and say, this is when it happened. But sometimes, the absence of evidence doesn't erase the feeling that something existed just outside of reach, because people who knew them often described the same thing. They understood each other, not through shared experiences, but through shared weight, the kind that doesn't need explaining. And maybe that's exactly why nothing ever fully formed. Because a connection like that doesn't lead to something simple. It becomes complicated, demanding, real. And Mitchum had spent his entire life avoiding anything that asked too much of him. So, whatever this was, whether it lived in a glance, a conversation, or just the quiet awareness of what could have been, it never crossed into something permanent. Some stories don't end. They just never begin. And Ava Gardner may have been the one woman in his life who reflected him too clearly, for him to ever let her get close enough to stay. The fantasy the world believed, but he never lived. There are some stories Hollywood writes for itself, and one of them was the idea of Marilyn Monroe and Robert Mitchum. On the surface, it made perfect sense. Two of the most magnetic presences of their time. Two people who carried a kind of quiet loneliness behind the image the world adored. If you believed the mythology of that era, they were almost destined to find each other. But real life doesn't always follow the script people expect. There was no confirmed romance, no hidden affair uncovered years later, no moment where their lives truly intertwined in the way audiences imagined. And yet, the rumor refused to disappear. Because sometimes it isn't about what happened. It's about what people needed to believe. Monroe represented something fragile beneath beauty, a kind of openness that invited protection. Mitchum represented the opposite, a man who never offered comfort, only distance. The idea of them together created a balance that felt almost poetic. But Mitchum didn't live in poetry. He avoided anything that required emotional responsibility. And Monroe, whether the world understood it or not, required exactly that. So whatever space existed between them, it remained untouched. Not because it couldn't happen, but because it shouldn't. And perhaps, somewhere deep down, Mitchum understood that better than anyone. Some connections become legendary without ever being real. And, in a strange way, that made this one more powerful than most, because it existed exactly where he was most comfortable, at a distance. The night that changed his name, forever. Long before the rumors, before the quiet affairs, before the image of a man who drifted without consequence, there was a night that forced Robert Mitchum into the light, and standing beside him was Lila Leeds. In 1948, the two were arrested together in what would become one of Hollywood's most talked-about scandals. Robert Mitchum marijuana, arrest 1948. It wasn't just the arrest that shook people, it was what it revealed. Mitchum didn't resist. He didn't deny. He didn't perform regret. While others scrambled to protect their image, he did something almost unheard of. He accepted it. Calmly, quietly, as if none of it surprised him. That was the moment the world began to understand something unsettling about him. He wasn't pretending to be anything. Lila Leeds, however, didn't walk away the same way. Where Mitchum's career absorbed the shock and eventually moved forward, hers didn't. The industry turned cold. Opportunities faded, and the name that had once held promise became tied to a moment she could never fully escape. And that contrast says everything. Because whatever existed between them that night, it wasn't love, it wasn't even romance, it was consequence. For Mitchum, it became part of the legend. The bad boy image that only made him more compelling. But beneath that image was a truth most people missed. He had always lived this way, unapologetic, unattached, untouched by the expectations that shaped everyone else. And maybe that's why, in the end, no scandal ever really changed him. Because it didn't reveal who he became. It revealed who he already was. 7 women, 7 moments, 7 different reflections of a man who never fully explained himself. But when the noise fades, when the stories settle into silence, a different truth begins to surface. Robert Mitchum didn't belong to the women who came and went. He belonged to the one who never asked him to. Dorothy Spence wasn't the loudest chapter of his life, but she was the longest, the quiet presence that never demanded, never chased, only remained. And perhaps, in the end, that's what he understood. Not every love needs to be proven. Some are simply lived, until there's nothing left to return to, except the one who was always there. If this story stayed with you, subscribe, and come back for the next one.